up everyone, Gordon Briley here with the Briley Fitness educational video series. So these videos are more about exercise and sometimes exercise nutrition, and today's video is going to be about exercise and exercise nutrition. So this topic is one of my favorite topics of all because it's so misunderstood, and when you get it right it can be ultra valuable for people who both exercise and do not exercise, because we're going to talk about a few things that may be really surprising, and there's a lot of people that love to argue this topic, how much protein you can absorb, blah blah blah. There's always arguments about this, but I want to break it down with a little bit of scientific information, but I don't want to get too much into it because then it just becomes boring. So what we want to talk about is muscle. And muscle itself, they call it actually the organ of longevity, because muscle is really important for overall general health. So just simply building muscle or stimulating muscle will equal, one of the most beneficial things about it is that it is the biggest user of glucose. And when we talk about health or lack of health, often what we're talking about is excessive glucose. That's what leads to insulin resistance, to diabetes type 2. So excess glucose really is one of the major problems when it comes to health. I would say that it's probably the biggest problem, and it's working its way into things that people don't even realize, like heart disease and cholesterol issues and things like that. But we don't want to get too much into that. So what we want to talk about when we talk about muscle is there's a couple things that are most important. So we'll go over that quickly. So protein synthesis. So that's essentially, keeping it simple, that is the biological building of proteins, cells that will build muscle. So protein synthesis is kind of the overall goal. And how we activate protein synthesis is by triggering a pathway, and that's mTOR. So that's one. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with it, but this is really something that you should read up on. Tons of good studies about it. We'll get into this a little bit more, but mTOR signals, essentially, keeping it short again, protein synthesis. So it's really valuable, it's really important to building muscle. But here's the weird part. Protein synthesis or activation of mTOR happens in a couple of different ways, and this is where people don't really realize it. So one that's more obvious is exercise. So exercise stimulates muscle growth, which is protein synthesis. So that's kind of obvious. But one of the ways that isn't so obvious is that protein synthesis can also be activated by nutrition itself. And this is where it's going to get really interesting. So when we want to build muscle or maintain muscle, we can do that, like I just said, multiple ways. When you're young, and this should be pretty interesting to some of you guys too, is when you're younger, so teen, testosterone's high, hormonally, you actually can eat less protein because your hormones are really what's stimulating protein synthesis. So the exercise part of it obviously is important, nutrition, but when we talk nutrition, protein is really what we're talking about in this video itself. So protein and exercise is actually what the video is called. So your need for protein when you're hormonally driving protein synthesis is much lower. So if you're younger with high hormones, you don't have the same needs as someone who's 30, 40, 50, and 65. As you age, your need for protein is much higher, actually. And what is it about protein that matters, and how does that really have much to do with muscle? And if we think about it, what I said was nutrition can trigger protein synthesis. So when you're eating protein, what it really breaks down into is amino acids. And there's many amino acids, but there's one that's really, really important. And this is one that actually triggers protein synthesis through mTOR. So there's a certain threshold. And when you get enough protein, it will actually stimulate muscle growth or keeping the muscle mass that you have. So as you age, the need, because the hormones start to decline slowly, the need for that stimulus is through nutrition, through protein itself, or leucine. You need to reach that threshold. And now what is that threshold? So as you age and your hormones are declining, so a minimum standard for protein per day, and we're going to talk a little bit about quantity and also quality, because they really do matter in this case. So if we're not stimulating muscle through exercise, typical, I don't want to say typical American, but a lot of Americans are not exercising, but you still need to stimulate protein synthesis and keep your muscle mass, because that is what leads to overall health. Now, to reach this threshold for leucine, if we're eating animal proteins, typically, and these are roundabout numbers, these aren't hard numbers. So in order to reach this leucine threshold, like I said, 100 grams of protein a day is going to be the absolute minimum. So women can get away with about 30 to 35 grams per meal, and that would be 3 times a day to reach that threshold. Now males, we're going to want to be much higher than that. And if we think about it, if we're stimulating it through exercise, protein synthesis, amazing, that's great. You're one step ahead. But now if we want to think about overall health, now what we're going to do is also stimulate protein synthesis again, but we're going to do it through that nutrition side with matching or meeting that leucine threshold. So that's a little bit about quantity, and you can figure some of this out based on your lean muscle mass. I think it's 0.18 per kilogram, but that's, again, just kind of a standard. But I'm telling you right now, 150 milligrams is going to be on the low side. And if you're exercising, it's definitely going to be higher than that. So quantity, and this is one of the interesting parts. In order to trigger that leucine threshold, as men, we need to have about 50 grams of protein to reach that leucine amount that we need to trigger that protein synthesis. So we don't want necessarily to have a bunch of small amounts of protein every single day, because if you eat a small amount of protein and only has so much leucine, and we don't trigger that, it's not doing us much good as far as keeping muscle. So what we want to do is have a bolus amount of protein, and that's going to be that 50 grams within each meal. And it sounds like a lot to a lot of people, but that's what it takes to stimulate this pathway through nutrition. So 50 grams of protein per meal, say we do 3 meals a day, because we don't always want to be grazing, because that just triggers insulin, and it's not triggering that leucine amount. So we want to make sure that we're getting enough, and we're getting it at the right times and not spreading it out, so you don't trigger that protein synthesis. So next, what we want to talk about is quality of proteins, and this one is also something you hear a lot of arguments about. So let's say plant-based proteins versus whey proteins, or a vegan diet, vegetarian diet with a lot of vegetables, and then an animal protein. So here's the difference between the two, is the plant-based proteins are very low in leucine. And we just talked about how important leucine is in reaching that threshold, but it has about half the amount of leucine that a whey protein does. So if you need that 30 grams to reach that leucine threshold with whey protein, with plant protein, it's literally going to be cut in half. So you're going to need 60 grams of that plant-based protein to actually elicit the response that we're looking for when we're taking in these amino acids. So not to bash on plant-based proteins, you just need to be educated on how it actually works so you can make good decisions that are actually going to affect your health. So there's something called BCAAs, branch chain amino acids, which are really high in leucine. You could actually supplement a plant-based protein with these BCAAs. And you could also do the same with whey protein. If you don't want to take 50 grams worth at a single time, you could do half of that and then also supplement some of those BCAAs on top of it. So quality matters. We want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can for our body and actually triggering the responses that are going to matter towards our health. So just for a slight review, the amount of protein, when you eat the protein, that all matters. So women, it's going to be 30 to 35 grams 3 times a day would be better than spreading it out. As you age, those numbers actually go higher because we're no longer hormonally driven. So just remember these things. There's a lot of studies to back this stuff up. And it's not bro science, and that's what we need to get away from. You can't digest more than 30 grams of protein. It's horseshit. It's the amount or the quality of the BCAA, or not BCAAs, but the amino acids within those foods that you're eating that ultimately matter. So quality, quantity, timing, essentially, those things really matter. So keep that in mind. And this is an interesting part too that a lot of people don't really understand too, is when we talked about two things that stimulate protein synthesis and activate the mTOR pathway. So exercise is one of those. Exercising will do that. That's great. That's what we want to do. So one of the misnomers is the day that you exercise, a lot of people think that your needs for protein are really high that day. You're going to have just a standard amount of protein on those days. It's actually the days that you're not exercising. So think about this. The exercise itself triggers that pathway that leads to protein synthesis. On the days you are not exercising, we also, again, want to stimulate that pathway for optimal health. So on the days off is really the days that you need those bolus amounts of protein. So you will trigger that pathway without actually exercising. And that's the value of understanding how it really works. Yes, you're going to need protein. And on those days off, it has more importance than on the day that you actually worked out. So a lot of people find that really interesting. And it's not really all that well understood. But really, again, it's all about stimulating protein synthesis and keeping that muscle mass, because that is what's going to utilize glucose, which ultimately is going to lead to much better health and longevity. Not to mention just having muscle mass, you're much more capable as a human. So everything that we do in life in some fashion should be about stimulating muscle, and the other half should be about keeping that muscle mass. So that's kind of, I wanted to try to keep it short, and of course it's already a 15-minute video. It's hard to want to keep it short when there's so much to talk about. But for now, I'm going to leave it at this, and you guys can come up with things, questions that you have, concerns that you have, because there's a lot of people that like intermittent fasting, and which is amazing, or my favorite is time-restricted eating, which is the type of fasting. And when you actually take in these amounts of protein, because it's perfectly fine to skip breakfast. So that next meal, if you're doing time-restricted eating, needs to be that large bolus amount, that 50 grams for a meal minimum, to trigger that response. So time restricted eating, this is perfectly fine. It's not for everyone. That's a different topic. So we can get into that later. But if you guys have questions about this topic, and maybe you're someone that does do fasting or a ketogenic diet, and they're kind of like the anti-protein, but you can see how important protein really is and its role. And there's a lot of things we could talk about with a ketogenic diet. We don't want to get into that either. So for now, we're going to end it here, and I want you guys to stay tuned to the next video. And as always, feel free to share this and comment if you have questions or concerns. So thanks for listening.